I would like to welcome Professor David Anthony from Hardwick College, who I believe needs no further introduction. He is the author, as most of you will know, of the book up here, Horse, Wheel and Language. Please, David.
So thank you, and thank you for inviting me here to this distinguished gathering. What I want to talk about today is Indo-European migrations, economies, and phylogenies. What I hope to do here is to first discuss phylogenies for the Indo-European languages that are derived entirely from linguistic evidence. Phylogenies are derived entirely from linguistic evidence. And then to compare these phylogenies with migrations. And migrations are documented only through archaeology. And by matching two different kinds of data from completely independent sources, I'm hoping to strengthen a particular phylogeny, a particular interpretation of Indo-European migrations. At the same time, it's impossible to understand why people migrate or the nature of migrations if you don't understand their economies and how they lived. So in order to discuss migrations, I also have to discuss prehistoric economies. Before I can really begin to discuss the phylogenies and migrations I would like to discuss, I think I have to start off by discussing a recent article that's caused a large stir in Indo-European studies. Article that came out at the end of last summer, end of August, beginning of September, mapping the origins and expansion of the Indo-European language family. Two of the authors, Gray and Atkinson, had previously published an earlier version of the same kind of study, the same kind of method, in 2003. What happened to get them this article in Science was that they added a geographic component, a mapping component, to their earlier study. The phylogeny that they produced was a kind of an odd phylogeny. It has Tocharian and Armenian in the same branch, and Greek and Albanian very close to each other. There are a number of peculiarities about the phylogeny itself. But the thing that really attracted attention to their article was that they rooted the Indo-European origins in Anatolia with the Anatolian Neolithic. Now here are scientists who are using methods derived from the study of the phylogeny, the origin and the diffusion of viruses, and applying this biological virus-based methodology to studying the phylogeny, origin, and diffusion of the Indo-European languages. And under almost any reweighting of the components in their model, they came up with a result that the Indo-European virus originated in Anatolia between 7,000 and 6,000 BC, and this is completely without paying any attention to archaeological evidence at all. Now, of course, this was seen as support for Colin Renfrew's proposal that the Indo-European languages began, Proto-Indo-European was spoken in Neolithic Anatolia and spread from there with the farming economy up into Europe. So here we have biologists who are not using any archaeological information, producing a model that agrees with an archaeologist who pretty much ignores linguistic evidence. And they came up with the same answer, and doesn't this prove that they're right? Not exactly. Because after their article was published, almost immediately after it was published, criticisms of their article began, the Buchert et al. Article. The first essay from GeoCurrents, a website that comes out of Stanford University, monitored by Martin Lewis and Asya Perlzweig, Mismodeling Indo-European Origin and Expansion, Buchert, Atkinson, Wade, and the Assault on Historical Linguistics. Other essays came out after that. one essay every 2 or 3 days for 2 months. More than 30 essays, referenced essays, with titles like Quentin Atkinson's Nonsensical Maps of the Indo-European, Language Expansion, the Malformed Language Tree of Buchert et al., The Hazards of Formal Geographic Modeling, Wheel Vocabulary Puts a Spoke in Buchert et al.'s Wheel. I'm going to come back to that. And there are many, many other titles. After you read these 30 essays, it's hard to have any faith at all in the Buchert et al. Article. It was criticized up and down on a variety of different grounds. But the ones that I find the most devastating are that really the Anatolian origin that they came up with was predetermined. It didn't rise out of their analysis. It was baked into their analysis because the initial split that they saw at the beginnings of the Indo-European differentiation, right here, is between Anatolian and all of the other Indo-European languages. Most linguists would agree that that is indeed a basic split. Then the second element in their model was that their mapping constraints made it necessary to place Anatolian in Anatolia. It could not be anywhere else. They were only allowed to map languages in places where they were historically known to have been spoken. And so they put Anatolian in Anatolia a priori. If you put the first split being between Anatolian and all of the other languages, and then you a priori place Anatolian in Anatolia, you're going to get a root that's going to be in Anatolia. The third element being the model of diffusion that they used was random walks, a model in which the Indo-European languages spread from the homeland by a process that is random with respect to direction and moves in very short increments. And if you model that across a flat plane, which is how they modeled the geography of the world, as a completely flat plane, interrupted only by seas, and they arbitrarily said that to cross a sea is 10 times more difficult than to cross land, which is a peculiar choice to make. The diversity and number of Indo-Iranian languages pulls the ideal center southward. The sea, the Black Sea here, makes it likely that the ideal center is not going to be on the north side of the sea because it's more difficult in their model to cross a sea, and that puts the center in Anatolia. So you have 3 elements going together. The initial split is between Anatolian and all of the other languages. Anatolian is a priori assigned to Anatolia at the beginning of their model, doesn't rise out of their model. And number 3, the random walk process by which the language is diffused is pulled south by the large number and diversity of Indo-Iranian languages so that the center ends up being in Anatolia. I don't like to say garbage in and garbage out about a paper that was published in Science, but the results were baked in before the analysis was finished. And it's not just me that feels that way. Quite a few linguists have criticized this article from a variety of directions. So where does that leave the Anatolian homeland hypothesis? Isn't Renfrew still supported by Gamkrelidze and Ivanov, who put an Indo-European homeland in Armenia somewhat to the east of the homeland that Renfrew would have preferred? They don't really support Renfrew. The Gamkrelidze and Ivanov homeland, they see their homeland as being quite distinct from a homeland farther west in Anatolia. And critically, they see the spread of Indo-European out of eastern Anatolia, Armenia, as occurring after 4000 BC, not 7000 to 6000 BC, not with the beginnings of the Neolithic. So that leaves really a Renfrew's Neolithic Anatolian origin hypothesis standing on its own as an archaeological hypothesis that has really very little support from linguistics. Also, the implications of this hypothesis are very important to consider. Beginning in 7000 BC in Anatolia, and by the time you get to the beginnings of the Neolithic in, say, the British Isles or Scandinavia, it's 3,000 years later. 3,000 years of language differentiation occurs before 4000 BC. 3,000 years, if we take 3,000 years back from now, we're back to the Hallstatt culture and the end of the Bronze Age, and it's plenty of time for language differentiation to occur. By the time the Neolithic arrived, the early Neolithic arrived in Britain and Scandinavia, we would expect dozens, if not hundreds, of Indo-European languages to be spread across Europe, fully differentiated. Which is impossible because of the wheeled vehicle evidence. It's just, to my mind, the chronology of the Anatolian Neolithic homeland and the spread with the beginnings of agriculture. While it's a very elegant theory, it unites the Indo-European expansion with an archaeological expansion that all archaeologists can agree with. There definitely was a spread of Neolithic farming from Anatolia into Greece and up into the rest of Europe. That's the elegant aspect of it, but it's impossible for it to be true because the Proto-Indo-European vocabulary contained a fully developed vocabulary for wheeled vehicles. There is at least two words, roots for wheel, the queklos root, the rote root. There is a root for thil, the harness pole. There's a root for axle. There is a root for a verb, wegete, meaning to go or convey in a vehicle. All of these roots are present from Germanic down to Iranian and Indic, with the sole exception of Anatolian. Anatolian only has the thil word. That's a word for a harness pole. It could possibly be the harness of a plow. It doesn't have to be a wheeled vehicle. So Anatolian is the one, and it's not a coincidence that it's the earliest Indo-European daughter branch that might not have the wheeled vehicle vocabulary. But post-Anatolian, all of the other Indo-European daughter branches are derived from a parent, a common, undifferentiated Proto-Indo-European parent that contained a fully developed vocabulary for wheeled vehicles. Wheeled vehicles were invented probably after 3500 BC, certainly after 4000 BC. All of the evidence for wheeled vehicles, and we have evidence in the form of written signs, three-dimensional models, two-dimensional images, and actual wagon burials. And all of this evidence can be dated between 3500 and 3100 BC. I'm going to talk more about this tomorrow when I'm really talking about transportation technology. Today I want to talk about migrations. But this evidence is an indisputable external fact. Wheeled vehicles were certainly invented after 4000 BC, probably after 3500 BC. The people who lived in Neolithic Anatolia could not have had a vocabulary for a technology that did not yet exist and would not exist for 3,000 years. The speakers of Proto-Indo-European were familiar with wheeled vehicles. The people who lived in Neolithic Anatolia were not familiar with wheeled vehicles. Therefore, the speakers of Proto-Indo-European could not have been the Neolithic Anatolians. It's chronologically impossible. This is, from my point of view, a barrier that I just cannot get across. So the date for common Indo-European, perhaps after the detachment of Anatolian, has to be after 3500 BC. Certainly after 4000 BC, probably after 3500 BC. The homeland that I prefer and that Mallory and Gimbutas have supported is in the steppes north of the Black and Caspian Seas. And really the reason that I put the homeland there is not so much that I'm following an archaeological tradition, but because of internal evidence within the Indo-European languages themselves. And this is what the kind of evidence that I would like to use throughout the talk today, and the kind of evidence that I think we ought to use when we're discussing Indo-European problems. The Indo-European problem is, in essence, a linguistic problem, and we should depend first and foremost on linguistic evidence. The internal evidence within Indo-European languages suggesting who the neighbors were is derived from loans and shared inheritances between Proto-Indo-European and other non-Indo-European languages, importantly Proto-Uralic. There's a large body of published studies suggesting that Proto-Indo-European shared such elements as a pronoun system, a common pronoun system, basic vocabulary terms like water and name, and other vocabulary with the speakers of Proto-Uralic. One time it was thought that this was a later sharing, but now, as far as I read the published evidence, it's being pushed more back to links between Proto-Indo-European and Proto-Uralic. And this moves the Proto-Indo-European homeland northward towards the northern forests. There are also shared vocabulary between Proto-Indo-European and language that was ancestral to Kartvelian, one of the Caucasian languages. If we put these two things together, that suggests that the Indo-European homeland should have been between the Kartvelian languages in the Caucasus and the Uralic languages in the northern forest zone, and that's the Eurasian steppes north of the Black and Caspian Seas. That's the real reason that I prefer Indo-European homeland there, because it's suggested by internal evidence of shared inheritances and loans between Proto-Indo-European and neighboring non-Indo-European languages. Now, this is not just a difference in location. I want to emphasize this, and it's sometimes described that way, as if this is just an argument between an Anatolian homeland and a steppe homeland. What's the real significance of this? Actually, there's very significant differences. When we get to modeling the spread, is where those differences lie. If Indo-European languages spread with a Neolithic economy, which is what Colin Renfrew has suggested, it's a rather simple social process that we're talking about, because in almost all cases where farming economies have spread into a territory that was occupied by foragers, the farming language replaces the language of the foragers because farmers have demographic advantages. It's a fairly mechanical replacement. However, if we put the homeland in the steppes and we put it after 3500 BC, then we're talking about Indo-European languages spreading into an environment in which all of this area is densely occupied by thriving farming cultures who have their own languages and adaptations. And most of the spread must have happened during what in the steppes at least would be the Bronze Age, and in other parts of Europe might be the late Neolithic. This is a period we know very well. We're already looking at the spread of the Indo-European languages. We're already studying it. We know these periods. We're just not looking at it from this point of view. And how a wave of language spread would pass through these shifting alliances of squabbling Bronze Age chiefdoms is not at all obvious, very different from the Renfrew hypothesis. So we need a completely different sociolinguistic explanation for language shift if we put the homeland in the steppes after 3500 BC. It's not just a difference in place, it's a difference in how. And yet, if the steppe homeland is true, it must have happened. So we have to come up with an explanation for why. The culture that's in the right place at the right time is the Yamnaya culture. It's situated between probable Proto-Uralic speakers somewhere up there in the forests, probably west of the Ural Mountains, and the pre-Kartvelian speakers in the Caucasus. It is the first culture that spreads all the way across the western steppes from the Urals to the eastern Carpathians. Before that, this area had been divided into numerous different regional cultures, at least 5 different regional cultures prior to 3300 BC. The Yamnaya people have wheeled vehicles, which are buried. There are more than 200 wagon burials associated with Yamnayan catacomb, early Bronze Age and Middle Bronze Age graves in this region. They have metallurgy. This guy, presumably, is a speaker of Proto-Indo-European, and he has this mace which weighs 0.5 kilogram of solid copper. They are metal workers. And the question is, how did the language that he spoke end up being spread all the way to Scotland and almost to the borders of China? Now, the phylogenies. There are a number of different ways of looking at the phylogenies of the Indo-European languages. This is one way of looking at it. This is the Starburst Pattern that Jim Mallory was talking about, well, in conversation yesterday. And this is a very common way of looking at the Indo-European languages. I want to emphasize that the parts of this phylogeny that we know and that we can really talk about with any kind of confidence are Proto-Indo-European at the root, which can be reconstructed on the basis of systematic comparison of the daughter branches, and the ends, things like this, Romance. We're pretty sure about that. We're pretty sure about the division of, say, West Germanic and North Germanic. But this part, between Proto-Celtic and Proto-Indo-European, should have a name. We don't have a name for this. This is one of the things I find frustrating, that linguists have not come up with a terminology to separate these things. This is Proto-Celtic. This should not be called Proto-Celtic. It's a phase in language evolution that's dark, that's defined by Proto-Indo-European at one end and Proto-Celtic at the other, and it's very long-lasting, and we really don't know what's going on in between there. And we shouldn't use the term that applies to this, Proto-Celtic, to apply to that. Proto-Celtic is a linguistic entity that can be described fairly accurately on the basis of its immediate daughters. I call this pre-Celtic, but I'm the only one, I think, who's doing this, that nobody's agreed on this terminology. Pre-Celtic is not really a definable linguistic entity. It's a phase in language evolution. It's quite a different thing from Proto-Celtic, and it's quite a different thing from Proto-Indo-European. I'm going to use the Rindge phylogeny. There are other phylogenies. Hans Holm here has a phylogeny. Eric Kemp has a phylogeny. I'm going to use the Rindge phylogeny, which was developed on the basis of computational cladistics in a similar way as the Buchert et al. Phylogeny, except that it was overseen by a historical linguist who really knew what he was doing, and the inputs that went into it were much freer of linguistic errors than the inputs that went into the Buchert et al. Phylogeny. This is a simplified version of Don Rindge's phylogeny. This business over here indicates that Germanic did not root well in his phylogeny, that came up with two different possible roots. Depending on which aspects of the data in Germanic you emphasized, you could get a root back here with Italic and Celtic indicating that Germanic split off relatively early, or you could get a root for Germanic that was down here with Baltic and Slavic, indicating that Germanic split off relatively late, and the Rindge cladistics was unable to resolve firmly between those two possible roots. So I made this swish out here indicating that it could be rooted in either one of those places. I think archaeologically, probably the earlier rooting is preferable. Now, if you look at this phylogeny, the first break-off is Anatolia. The second is Tocharian, which Jim Mallory has just educated us about. The third is a complicated root, which includes Celtic and Italic and possibly Germanic, then Greek, and then finally Indo-Iranian, Baltic, Slavic, the Satem languages. I'm going to use this as the basis for trying to reconstruct migrations that would match the first three roots, the first three splits. But before I do that, I want to talk about the mechanisms of language spread. Unfortunately, when we talk about Indo-European migrations, too often we don't really talk about the mechanisms by which the language replaced earlier languages in places that were not Indo-European speaking. And we just make a dramatic assumption based on Hollywood stereotypes that the mechanism was this. Attila the Hun lining up on the horizon with a savage bunch of horse-riding nomads and sweeping in, looting, raping, and pillaging, and somehow this leads to a language shift. Again, I would like to abandon this anachronistic image, which is, of course, from the medieval period, and use the evidence that's contained in the Indo-European vocabulary itself, the reconstructed vocabulary, in order to understand the process of language shift. And I look at this from maintaining social relations. There's a couple of different ways, basic ways to maintain social relations in the tribal societies of Neolithic and Bronze Age Europe. There's face-to-face village interaction in which social relations, and in particular maintaining hierarchical social relations, is maintained through action and daily observation. You see these people all the time. If you don't pay your cow tribute to the local feast, then the chief is going to come right down the street and grab you and make sure that you do. And then there's distance relations, which are typical of mobile pastoralism, in which social relations are maintained through reputation, through speech, through song, and through occasional group events. Now, there may still be some guys who are going to come down and grab you to make sure that you pay your cow tribute if you're in a chiefdom, but they have to come a longer way in order to do so, and it's a completely different dynamic for maintaining social structure. And I would say that during a general shift to greater mobility, number two has the advantage, and that there was a general shift to greater mobility in Europe after about 3000 BC, with the rise of a more pastoral economy and less village-based economies. So what institutions did Proto-Indo-European speakers possess to maintain social relations at a distance? Based on the reconstructed vocabulary, you can say that the speakers of Proto-Indo-European were familiar with the system in which there were patrons and there were clients. This is the hierarchical aspect of their system. In fact, the relationship between gods and humans in Indo-European religion was pretty much a relationship between patrons and clients, meaning humans are in the position of clients and the gods are in the position of patrons. And as a client, if I do certain things for you, my patron, then you're obligated to do certain things for me, your client. If I sacrifice in the right way and I say the right words and I do it at the right time, then you're obligated to give me fat cattle, swift horses, and male children, as they say in the Rig Veda. And this is typical of a patron-client system. Both sides have obligations to each other, but it's quite hierarchical. The speakers of Proto-Indo-European recognized that there were rich people, that there were wealthy people. They had words for that. They had also institutions of hospitality, the guest-host relationship, which is a cross-cutting, much more egalitarian relationship in which guests and hosts might exchange places with each other. And this allows people to extend protection and hospitality and friendship to people that they might not be familiar with. An extremely useful social institution for mobile pastoralists who might be moving through each other's pastures and temporarily need to do so with safety and protection. They also were familiar with feasts at which there were sacrifices of milk and cattle, praise poetry, a whole variety of poetry that was discussed by Calvert Watkins, How to Kill a Dragon, and of course the praise poetry brought fame to the patron who sponsored the feast. Of these, I think that the feast is the aspect that ties in with anthropological theory the easiest. There's a large body of studies. Michael Dietler at Yale particularly edited a very good book on feasts and feasting, which shows that in tribal societies, feasting is the principal way to achieve and maintain power in low-level chiefdom societies. Whether you're talking about the South Pacific or South America, Central America, North America, Africa, or in Ireland, Gibson's studies. Feasting is the principal way in which a powerful man would maintain his power over his followers by occasionally bringing them in to an occasion at which he himself was praised and his fame was recognized. Of course, this is the integrative aspect. This is the aspect in which, this is a way, as far as I'm concerned, of attracting followers who might have been speaking another language. If they come to these events, they get to know you over food and drink. They hear the poetry. It's a special, happy event. And if they learn the poetry, and they say the right words to the gods in the right way and do the sacrifices in the right way, then maybe they can be a patron themselves, or their kids might some days be patrons. The other aspect that you can see in Indo-European vocabulary is the punitive aspect. They certainly had roving war bands of youths. Dory Brown was talking about this yesterday, the Manderbunde, Luperci, the Vratyas. There is a sort of a uncertain route for booty, but there are at least 3 routes for steal. There are at least 4 routes for quarrel. There are at least 10 routes for strike, wound, stab, kill, destroy, and there are the routes for destroy and victory. This is a society that had these words in its vocabulary. It was certainly a society that was familiar with warfare. And the roving bands of war youths might have been one of the ways that speakers of other languages would have been introduced to the speakers of Proto-Indo-European. So there's the good side and the bad side. Okay, let's look at the archaeological evidence for these migrations. The first split in Ringe et al. Is the split of Anatolian. For Anatolian to have come from the steppes, we should have a migration that goes from the steppes to Anatolia, either through the Caucasus or through southeastern Europe. And in fact, the earliest migration you can identify that comes out of the steppes, you can identify archaeologically, goes to the southeast, to the southwest, into southeastern Europe, at about 4300 to 4100 BC. This was a migration there's not a lot of sites related to this migration, but they're quite distinctive. And they go down through the steppe corridor here, and down into the Dobruja and eastern Bulgaria. Another line goes across Transylvania and into eastern Hungary. These intrusive sites are associated with the abandonment of between 500 and 600 tells, which happened at the same time. This humus line here indicates the abandonment of this tell of Koranovo at the end of Koranovo 6, after which it remained abandoned for about 1,000 years. And not only the Koranovo tell, but all of the tells that are associated with the Koranovo civilization, old European tells in the lower Danube Valley, eastern Bulgaria and along the shores of the Black Sea, 500 to 600 tells abandoned. Pottery changes, very sudden change in pottery styles, abandonment of female figurines, the metallurgical industry collapses, and in the Balkans at least, you can't find any settlements at all for the next 500 to 700 years in the area where this tell is. The period after that abandonment, there is no archaeological sites at all that archaeologists can recognize for the next 500 to 700 years. It's just a period of abandonment. The people who are coming in at this time from the steppes, how are they organized? When you look at the economic information for this period, the Neolithic period in the steppes, there's a set of sites over on the Dnieper and another set of sites in the middle Volga. They pretty much agree with each other in terms of the nature of the economy. They have domesticated cattle and sheep, but it's a minority of the animal bones in their archaeological sites. Most of the animal bones are wild. Horses make up a very large percentage of the animal bones in these sites, except in the cemeteries. Falinsk Cemetery, 100% domesticated animals. So domesticated animals, unusual in the daily diet, absolutely mandatory in feasting deposits. It looks like domesticated animals are being used during this period in the Neolithic as a ritual currency. not so much as a regular element of the daily diet, although they're there, they're hurting the animals, but the time when they're really using the animals is as a feasting currency in ritual deposits associated with funerals, and probably at other happier occasions as well. But archaeologically, where we can see it is in the funeral deposits in the graves. It's a very interesting pattern, and I think myself that domesticated animals first entered the steppes not as a food source the way we would think of it, but really as a ritual currency, and were regarded that way for several hundred, maybe even 1,000 years. So these people who are moving into the steppes, when you look at the stable isotopes in their diet, and these are stable isotopes from the Phalanx cemetery and from two other cemeteries in the Middle Volga region, they indicate a mainly fish diet. So from the stable isotopes and from the animal bones that you see in the settlements, you can see that most of the diet is not, the daily diet is not based on domesticated sheep and cattle. However, when you get to a cemetery deposit, it's 100% sheep, cattle, and horse. The animal bones that are deposited in the Phalanx cemetery, you can see here, there's at least 85 sheep, 29 cattle, and 16 horses, and those are the only animals that are deposited there. The horses are being deposited with domesticated cattle and sheep. We don't know if they're domesticated or not, but they're being treated like domesticated animals, and I think they probably are domesticated already. There's also quite a lot of imported copper at the Phalanx cemetery. That's a little copper. These are copper beads. That's a little copper bracelet. That's copper. There's copper bead bangles up here, and some of the copper has trace elements that indicates that it came from Bulgarian, down here, Bulgarian sources. So this copper is being traded through Varna all the way up the steppes and all the way up to Phalanx. And the horses, and I'll talk more about this tomorrow, but there are head and hoof deposits of horses and symbolic images of horses in some of these graves. The Siozhia grave is right there. There's Siozhia, not that far from Phalanx. And then there's, and then there is this migration from the Pontic steppes into the lower Danube in eastern Bulgaria, 4300 to 4100 BC, the abandonment of the tells, and while they're there, they're picking up quite a bit of prestige goods from the local societies, including copper bracelets, gold. Here is a boar's tusk ornament, chest ornament, typical for Phalanx and Siozhia, the Neolithic and the steppes. But here in this deposit in the lower Danube Valley, it's studded with copper beads. The graves are put in very commanding positions overlooking the lower Danube Valley, and I want to remind you that this is a lower Danube Valley that had tells in it, but after these people got there, there's no occupation in the tells anymore. So that's a possible, that is a there's definite evidence for an archaeological migration from the steppes into the lower Danube Valley. That's the earliest one. Did they carry Anatolian languages with them, or pre-Anatolian, some distant ancestor of Anatolia? Possibly. At least it matches up chronologically with the Ringe phylogeny and the expected directions. Later on, I would expect if we were going to link this to Anatolian, we would have to suppose that these people later on moved down through the Balkans and into northwest Anatolia. I would guess probably around the time of Troy I. The second split is Tocharian, and Jim has already talked about that, so I'm not going to talk about that anymore, other than to put up my image that, the image that I had put up, that Jim had put up earlier. The link between Afanasyevo and Yamnaya is a pretty firm one. They have the same metal types, sleeved axes, copper daggers. They have the same grave types. They're buried in the same pose, in the same grave form, with the same kind of kurgan over them. They have the same kind of ceramic types. Afanasyevo introduces domesticated cattle and sheep to the Western Altai, and horses to the Western Altai. It really looks like an intrusive package that's coming in. It's quite a long migration from the homeland over here to the Altai, and it's unexplained. It's something that Jim and I have talked about a lot. You know, why did they do this? And I actually don't have a good explanation for why they did this, but it certainly looks like that's what happened, because this is a completely intrusive package that comes in. If you eliminate the anomalous early dates, perhaps around 3300 BC, and establishes pastoral economies in the Western Altai that are then the basis for the development of later pastoral cultures in the Western Altai from then on. So I'll go to the third migration. At least we have a migration that's going in the right direction there. It's in the right sequence. And it could have introduced Tocharian or some distant ancestor, a pre-Tocharian language, to the Western Altai. The third split is pretty complicated. It introduces the ancestors of pre-Italic and pre-Celtic and maybe pre-Germanic into Western Europe, according to the Ringe phylogeny. What we would want this one to look like, maybe, is to be a migration from the steppes, if the steppes are still the homeland, in two streams. One maybe to the south for Italic and Celtic, and one maybe to the north for pre-Germanic. And it should be after the invention of wheeled vehicles and after the departure of Tocharian, and this migration fits those criteria. It departs from the Yamnaya culture area around 3000 BC. The Yamnaya people, there is the Neolithic stable isotopes indicating a fish diet. The Yamnaya people, though, belong over here. Yamnaya is indicated there as EBA, the red squares, and Yamnaya introduces this new diet that is based entirely on pastoral products, and once it's introduced, it stays there. The MBA pattern is sitting right on top of the EBA pattern, and the late Bronze Age pattern is sitting right on top of the MBA pattern. Isotopically, this diet, once it begins in the beginning of Yamnaya, doesn't change. So these people are fully dependent on pastoral products. It's interesting also that they have a high degree of nutritional deficiencies. This line here, which is over Yamnaya, shows a peak in enamel hypoplasia, which is a condition which shows up in the teeth, which indicates nutritional deficiencies during childhood. Cribra orbitalia, also, which is porosity on the inside of the eye socket on the bone, also indicates nutritional deficiencies during childhood. And there's also a peak here in pathologies related to violence, wounds. So it's a violent period compared to later periods in the steppes. And it's also a period when they're introducing a new economy, a brand new pastoral economy. They haven't adapted very well to it yet, and consequently they're suffering dietary stress as they begin to figure out how to base a diet entirely on pastoral products. It's possible that they don't have the lactose tolerance gene yet, but that this kind of stress may have caused the lactose gene, when it appeared, to spread very rapidly. The evidence for the migrations. There's a Yamnaya migration down the Danube Valley following pretty much the path that the 1,000-year earlier migration had followed, but this one is much, much better documented archaeologically. There are many, many more sites. There's a great many Yamnaya barrows in eastern Bulgaria. There are hundreds here in the lower Danube Valley. There are hundreds here in this area of eastern Hungary. There's no question that around 3000, 2800 BC, there's a large movement from the steppes that goes up the Danube and into eastern Hungary. That movement could have brought the ancestors of pre-Italic and pre-Celtic into, say, the Carpathian Basin. I'm not going to try to figure out exactly the later steps. I don't think we should expect, once that after this archaeological evidence for this migration appears, that we are going to see a perfect evidence coded in pottery types for every subsequent change in language from the introduction of the first Indo-European speakers to the emergence of Proto-Italic as a language with that labeled on a pot somewhere. But this does get people from the homeland in a migration into the right part of Europe. At the same time, there's another migration up here on the north side of the Carpathians, which is less known because because it worked in a different way, and it actually began a little bit earlier. On your left is a picture of the forest steppe region, which is elevated above the steppe lowlands. You have to think of this as being higher and more rainy. The area that's inside the black circle is an area where you can conduct rainfall agriculture. Closer to the steppes, it's lower. It falls down to the bottom of a bowl. It's quite dry, and you can't conduct rainfall agriculture there. So that's why there are no Tripolia sites, the black dots, in the steppe region. But they're quite dense in the forest steppe. A perfect zone for agriculture even today. For those of you who are familiar with the giant Tripolia sites, these mega sites that had 250, 300, 400 hectare sites, they were located, I'm lost here. There. They were located right in here. Huge sites near the border with the steppes. After 300 BC, after 3300 BC, this whole area is abandoned, and there are Yamnaya tumuli there. The Usatovo culture appears in the coast, and it's completely integrated with the Tripolia sites along the Dniester. Late Tripolia sites separate into two groups, one on the Dniester and one north, up around around Kiev, on the Dnieper. If I had to guess, I would say that this group up here is going to emerge later on as pre-Slavic, and that the pre-Germanic languages are moving up the Dniester and towards Poland that way. And I say that because Usatovo in the steppes was a very hierarchically organized society. There are Kurgan graves at Usatovo that have daggers with midribs in the central grave, only in the central grave. There's amber in these graves. There's agate and marble indicating contact with the Aegean, and silver indicating contact with the Caucasus. The flat graves that are peripheral to the central grave over here contain very little in the way of grave goods, and right next to the Kurgan cemetery there are two separate cemeteries just of flat graves that contain almost nothing, which are very similar to cemeteries that are found here in the Tripolia sites. They have flat graves too. So you have flat graves here that are very much like the flat graves here. Those graves have female figurines in them, but they don't have metal or daggers, and they are positioned peripherally to central graves that have daggers and imported prestige goods. It's a very hierarchical system represented in a single cemetery, and I think it's a good expression of patrons and clients. Probably the Usatovo people had a patron-client relationship with the Tripolia people. The Tripolia people shift their language to the language of their patrons, and those languages spread up the Dniester into southeastern Poland, where, let me see, yeah. Up in here, there are a variety of different sites, and up in here that are late TRB. These are heavily fortified. There's a lot of Tripolia pottery on these sites coming up the Dniester, and as I said, there's amber from up here showing up in the Usatovo culture. There's a lot of movement back and forth up there through that corridor, and I think that's how probably the Indo-European languages eventually ended up being substrate prior to the emergence of corded ware, so that some Eastern corded ware groups were speaking Indo-European languages even before corded ware itself really emerged. And then finally, I think that after 3000 BC, as wheeled vehicles spread through Europe, there was a movement towards greater mobility, abandonment of nucleated village occupations across Europe, and the beginnings of a new way of life that was much more based on pastoralism, living in wagons, the single grave culture, and as people shifted to this new mode of life, they needed to maintain social relations with each other using institutions that had been developed earlier in the steppes. And it wasn't that the steppe people were superior in any way, but they had developed these institutions for maintaining social relations at a distance, which turned out to be extremely useful in a Europe which was switching to a more mobile lifestyle. And so the institutions and the language that they were encoded in spread as a useful way to maintain social connections in a more mobile world, such as the world we're facing right now. So I think that we can show here that there are at least, for the first 3 splits in the Ringe phylogeny, that there are migrations that match the first 3 splits, 1 to the southeastern Europe, 2 to Tocharian, and 3A and 3B inside the Carpathian Basin, and then north of the Carpathians that match the expectations and sequence suggested by Ringe. The predictions of the Ringe phylogeny are borne out by independent evidence from archaeology, which I think supports the Ringe phylogeny, and the Ringe phylogeny supports the hypothesis that this might account for the initial spread of the Indo-European languages. Now, of course, this is just a superficial review of each one of these migrations. There are a lot of debates associated with each one. Just the Tocharian one we heard a lot about before. And we could talk more about Tocharian or about any one of these, but I think I've talked long enough for today, so I thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much. We have plenty of time for comments and questions. John?
Thank you for this very enlightening talk. I have 2 questions. The first goes on the homeland, the Indo-European homeland theory that you would like to place there, mainly or at least partly because the neighborhood of the pre-Carthusian and Proto-Uralic homelands. My question is, how sure are we that their homelands are placed exactly there? I mean, the Proto-Carthusian and Proto-Uralic homeland. I know there are several theories about Proto-Uralic homeland, for instance. I mean, we know it's there they are now, but were they there at that time? My second question goes on the migrations. You have put now the 3 first splits on the phylogenic tree there that could correlate to migrations. But what about the last 2 ones, the Armenian Greek and the dialect continuum of Indo-Iranian Balto-Slavic? I know you didn't have time to talk about that, but do we have migrations about that too? These were my 2 questions.
Okay, so the first one, where was Proto-Uralic spoken? Of course there are differences of opinion on this. The most serious difference of opinion, from my point of view though, is whether Proto-Uralic was spoken perhaps in the Yenisei, that theory, which I see and this is, I'm an archaeologist, but from my reading, that is a minority opinion, that Proto-Uralic was located that far to the east. If it was located that far to the east, it would give me a real problem. But if it's in any of the more western homelands that have been suggested, I think almost any of them are all right with me. I put it west of the Ural Mountains. Basically, my approach to Proto-Uralic homeland is this. The Proto-Uralic speakers lived in the northern forests. We know that. We're in agreement on that. And they had no domesticated animals. They were hunters and gatherers. Okay, so we're agreed on that. If Proto-Indo-European and Proto-Uralic shared vocabulary and pronoun systems, that pulls the Proto-Indo-European homeland northward towards the forest zone. Now it can slide along the southern edge of the forest zone in a variety of different places, but it pulls it northward. So that's my basic idea there. In addition to that, we know that the speakers of Proto-Indo-European did have domesticated animals, no question. We're agreed on that. If you go east of the Ural Mountains on this diagram, east of what I've listed as the Indo-European homeland. There's no domesticated animals in central Kazakhstan, cattle and sheep, until 2000 BC or maybe a little bit before, which is too late for the Indo-European homeland. By 2000 BC, we know that the Indo-European languages were already differentiated into Anatolian, which is documented by 1900 BC in Karam-Kanesh, and Indic at the very least, which is probably can be dated 1500 BC, and Mycenaean Greek. The three earliest ones are probably already differentiated by 2000 BC. 2000 BC is just too late for an Indo-European homeland. So the fact that the Indo-European speakers had domesticated animals really limits them to west of the Ural Mountains before 2000 BC. That's one thing. And the fact that they're neighboring Uralic puts a northern edge on them. And that's really, that's why I put them there, rather than because I think that I know where the Proto-Uralic homeland is. It's those two elements together. The second question, I'm going to talk a little bit about Indo-Iranian tomorrow when I talk about chariots. And I just didn't have time to do it today. Some of these splits are extremely difficult to link up with archaeological evidence. I think the first three are, but after the first three splits happen, there is no Indo-European homeland anymore. Greek probably split off from some daughter, not from the homeland itself. I think the homeland is no longer a usable term after about 2500 BC. They're already differentiated. They've gone off to the Altai. They're in southeastern Europe. They're beginning to spread up north of the Carpathians. And they may not even remember where the homeland was themselves. It may be some words that are retained in folklore and in songs, but the homeland itself is no longer a viable concept after a certain number of splits have happened.
Okay, thank you.
That's fine.
Yes, regarding the Wunsch phylogeny, only few people know that he, or everybody knows that he was a linguist. Okay. Few people know that he sacrificed around 2/3 of his wonderful words to match the phylogeny, and that is a very, very bad sign and gives every reason not to trust that phylogeny or that tree in this case.
That he sacrificed?
Yes.
Did you say 2/3?
Yes, he skipped around. He started with over 300 lexemes and grammatical phonemes and so on, and they didn't match the phylogeny, and they had to be skipped, and that is no good.
I see. So he was throwing out evidence that didn't match his phylogeny.
So it is not his work what we see here.
I'll have to go back in and look at his publications for that.
On the other side,
You're saying that nobody knows this. Is that what? Is that
few
how?
people. I have
people.
the data.
So how do you know it?
I know the data.
Yeah.
Completely.
Well, yeah. This is the kind of
course.
argument that's difficult to have because you're saying I know the data and very few other people do.
It's not so easy, but I have them here.
So
can show
I mean,
you.
I have to believe you, but
Yeah.
but I haven't seen it myself.
Yeah, I can demonstrate. And the next is that the phylogeny of Buchardt is not so bad, because with the exception of Hittite and Tocharian, it is now completely the same as my own.
And this makes it good.
Regarding that, we are both have a completely different approaches, different data set, and different mathematical methods.
And so what part, so with the exception of the...
In particular, the Western languages are exactly that was what I computed.
So, you would agree then that, I'm having a hard time getting to it,
Yeah,
you would agree
this
that Indo-Iranian and Balto-Slavic, which share the RUK-I rule and the Satem shift, should be put in different phylogenetic branches.
All the 5 left parts or branches are exactly that what I compared to.
And you would agree that Italic and Celtic, which are Kentum languages, are descended from languages which have the Satem shift, but they didn't pick it up.
Which one?
In this phylogeny, Italic and Celtic are the latest branches to emerge, and they emerge from a series of other branches that have already innovated with the Satem shift. But the Celtic and Italic languages don't have it.
Satem is long ago, for 20 or 30 years, no criterion for a subgrouping of Indo-European.
Nevertheless, if you're going to construct a phylogeny based on the retention of innovations, then the branches that are farther down the phylogeny should show some evidence of the innovations that occur farther up the phylogeny.
We cannot discuss it here.
Yeah, yeah.
Okay, that's all.
Nikolai?
Just a quick question. In your first migration, the Anatolian one, you sort of left them at the lower Danube, and then you said, well, so after that they went to Anatolia. I suppose it's just lack of time that prevents you from showing the same archaeological data supporting this as you did for the first step.
Yes, yeah, the secondary steps are a whole other subject, as Jim clearly showed. You know, you can get Indo-European speakers to the Altai, but getting them from there into the Tarim Basin is a whole other set of debates. After archaeological sites re-emerge in the Balkans, after this period of hiatus between about 4200 BC and about 35 or 3300 BC, in the Balkans there's no archaeological sites at all. And then what comes up after that is reoccupation of some of the old tells in the early Bronze Age, the Ezero culture. Ezero shows strong material links to Troy I. In fact, Troy I is more like a Southeast European Balkan culture than it is like an Aegean culture. And then Troy II, the direction of the cultural connections of Troy shifts dramatically to the Aegean and Anatolia and the civilizations to the south. But Troy I really looks, in a lot of its pottery, like it's strongly connected to the Balkans. And it's that material culture connection that I would cite to build a bridge materially, archaeologically, between southeastern Europe and northwestern Anatolia. And Troy I would be a critical place to occupy if the speakers of pre-Anatolian turned into the speakers of Proto-Anatolian. Say around northwestern Anatolia, around the time of Troy I, it would give them a platform from which the Anatolian languages could spread across Anatolia.
Okay, thank you.
Other questions? That seems not to be the case. Okay, thank you very much again for this very educating, interesting lecture.